Hello, and welcome to Stories Before Sleep. It's late, and the last traces of noise are slipping away. As you settle into the quiet, there's something simple I want to share, a truth so soft. It's easy to overlook, yet strong enough to change everything. Now you might think habits are just small things, the way you brush your teeth, your morning coffee, the path you walk every day. But here's what I've learned as a historian, and what science is finally catching up to: your habits are actually the architecture of your life. They're the invisible forces that shape who you become. Think about that for a moment. Every single day, you're not making hundreds of conscious decisions. You're running on autopilot, on habits. And most of us never really understand how they work. We try to change them through sheer willpower. We fail. We feel bad. We give up. But what if I told you there's a science to this? A real provable way to understand how habits form and how to change them? What if the answers have been hiding in history all along, waiting for us to notice? That's what tonight's story's about. It's about understanding yourself better. And as you drift towards sleep, I think you'll find something here that resonates. Something that might just change how you see your own life. Imagine stepping into Olympia in the year 350 before Christ. The dust hasn't settled yet from yesterday's training. You'd smell at first sweat mixed with olive oil, the particular earthiness of a place where thousands of bodies have pushed themselves to their limits. The stadium stretches out before you, simple and brutal. No stands, no crowds watching. Just the track, the field, and the men who came here to become something more than they were. Aristotle walked these grounds regularly. The philosopher didn't come to watch competitions. He came to observe. He'd position himself near the wrestlers' training area, his mind working through questions that would occupy him for decades. How do people become excellent at what they do? What's the mechanism? What's the actual process? There was a young wrestler named Nicias. We don't know much about him now, but Aristotle noticed him. Nicias wasn't the strongest man in the stadium. He wasn't the most naturally gifted. But something about the way he trained caught the philosopher's attention. Day after day, the same routine, the same movements, the same progression. Nicias would arrive before dawn. The other wrestlers were still sleeping in their quarters. He'd walk to the practice ground where the sand had been raked smooth the night before. His trainer, an older man named Demetrios, would be waiting. They'd start with stretching. Not the kind of stretching you might imagine. This was deliberate, methodical. Demetrios would guide Nicias' body through movements, holding positions, pushing gently against resistance. 5 minutes. 10. The muscles warming, becoming pliable. Then came the footwork drills. Nicias would move across the sand in patterns, forward and back, side to side, pivoting on one foot while the other leg swept through the air. This went on for what felt like hours. Demetrios would call out corrections. Your weight is too far forward. Keep your center lower. Again, the same movements repeated until they became something other than conscious effort. By mid-morning, other wrestlers arrived. The real training began. Nicias would grapple with opponents of different sizes and styles. Some were stronger. Some were faster. Some had techniques he'd never encountered. Each match taught him something. Each fall, each escape, each moment of being pinned down added to his understanding. But here's what Aristotle noticed. Nicias didn't try to invent new techniques. He practiced the fundamentals, over and over. The same holds, the same footwork patterns he drilled alone, the same breathing rhythm, the heat built throughout the day. By afternoon, the sun beat down on the stadium with relentless intensity. Nicias would be covered in sand and sweat. His body ached. His mind felt foggy. This is when most people stop. This is when the body screams to rest. But Nicias continued, not with the same intensity as the morning. The afternoon work was different, lighter, more technical. He'd practice specific sequences, a setup into a throw, a defense against a particular hold. The movements were slower but precise. What struck Aristotle most profoundly wasn't the physical training itself. It was something else entirely. Nicias had stopped thinking about what he was doing. His body had learned. His hands knew where to go. His feet understood the geometry of balance without his mind calculating it. When an opponent moved, Nicias responded instantly, not through conscious decision, through habit. This happened gradually. Aristotle understood that excellence didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated, day by day, month by month, year by year. The wrestler who showed up in the morning, who performed the same drills, who grappled with opponents, who pushed through fatigue, that wrestler became something different. Not through a single moment of transformation, through the accumulation of small repeated actions. Nicias had a ritual before leaving the stadium each day. He'd sit in the shade of the portico. He'd drink water mixed with wine. He'd review the day in his mind. What had worked? What hadn't? Where had his technique failed? Where had his body responded correctly without his conscious direction? This reflection, this attention to what was happening, seemed to accelerate the process. By the time Aristotle had observed Nicias for several months, the transformation was visible. The wrestler moved differently, more economical, more powerful, not because his muscles had grown dramatically larger, though they had, but because his nervous system had learned. His body had internalized patterns. The repetition had created something that looked like instinct, but was actually learned behavior. Aristotle would later write about this. He'd use the word hexis, often translated as habit or disposition. He understood that we become what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. The wrestler who practices excellence becomes excellent. The person who practices courage becomes courageous. The mind and body don't distinguish between what we do once and what we do repeatedly. Repetition changes us at a fundamental level. What Nicias didn't know, what Aristotle was beginning to understand, was that he was participating in something universal, something that would apply to every human being who ever lived. The mechanism was the same whether you were learning to wrestle in ancient Olympia or learning anything else. The body and mind respond to repetition. They adapt. They change. They become. As the sun set over the stadium, casting long shadows across the sand, Nicias would walk back to his quarters. His body tired but satisfied. His mind calm. He'd sleep deeply that night, and tomorrow he'd return to do it all again. The same drills, the same opponents, the same progression. He didn't know he was part of history. He didn't know that a philosopher was watching, trying to understand the fundamental nature of human change. He just knew that if he kept showing up, if he kept practicing, he would become the wrestler he wanted to be. And he was right. The monastery of Saint Benedict sat in the valleys of northern France, surrounded by forests that seemed to stretch forever. In the year 1247, Brother Thomas had lived within its stone walls for 7 years. He'd come here as a young man seeking something he couldn't name. Peace, perhaps. Purpose. A way to live that made sense when the world outside offered only confusion. The monastic life followed a structure so rigid it might have seemed suffocating to an outsider. The day began before dawn, with matins the first prayer service. Every monk rose from his narrow bed in the dormitory and made his way through darkness to the chapel. This happened regardless of how he felt, regardless of whether sleep had come easily or not. The bell rang. The monks responded. This had been the pattern for centuries. Brother Thomas struggled with matins more than any other part of his day. His mind refused to cooperate. While other monks seemed to slip into prayer with natural ease, his thoughts scattered. He'd find himself thinking about the bread he'd baked the day before, or the repair work needed on the monastery's roof, or conversations from years past that had no business occupying his attention during sacred time. He'd catch himself and try to refocus. For a moment, his mind would settle. Then it would wander again. This frustrated him deeply. He'd chosen this life specifically to cultivate spiritual discipline. Yet here he was, 7 years and still unable to maintain focus during the most important hours of the day. The other monks seemed to manage it. Brother Anselm, who slept in the cell next to Thomas's, appeared to enter a state of genuine devotion the moment he knelt. Brother Cuthbert, the oldest monk in the community, moved through prayer with a kind of natural grace that suggested his mind never wandered at all. Thomas began to believe he simply lacked the capacity for this work. Perhaps he'd made a mistake coming here. Perhaps he wasn't meant for monastic life. These thoughts troubled him more than his wandering mind during prayer. He considered speaking to the abbot about leaving. He considered requesting a transfer to a different monastery where perhaps the work would suit him better. One morning, after yet another frustrating session at matins, Thomas found himself in the scriptorium, where he worked copying manuscripts. This was his assigned labor, the work he performed for 6 hours each day. His hands moved across the parchment with practiced precision, forming letters in the careful script the monastery required. The work demanded attention, but not the kind of intense focus that exhausted him. His mind could settle into a rhythm while his hands did their work. Brother Anselm entered the scriptorium to collect a finished manuscript. He paused, watching Thomas work. "You seem troubled," Anselm said. It wasn't a question. Thomas set down his quill. He found himself admitting what he'd been carrying. His difficulty during prayer, his sense of failure, his consideration of leaving. The words came out in a rush as if they'd been waiting for permission to emerge. Anselm listened without interrupting. When Thomas finished, the older monk sat on the bench across from him. "Tell me something," Anselm said. "When you copy these manuscripts, do you think about the words you're writing?" Thomas considered this. "Not always. Sometimes I do. Sometimes my mind wanders, just as it does during prayer. But your hand continues," Anselm observed. "The letters remain precise. The work continues regardless of where your mind travels." "That's different," Thomas said. "The work doesn't require my full attention." Anselm shook his head slightly. "You're thinking about prayer incorrectly. You believe it requires perfect attention, perfect focus, as if your mind must never stray. But that's not how the human mind works. The mind wanders. This is its nature. Fighting against this nature exhausts you." Thomas didn't understand. "Then how do you maintain devotion during matins?" "I don't maintain anything," Anselm replied. "I show up, I kneel, I speak the words. I return my attention when it strays. I return it again and again. This happens hundreds of times during a single prayer service. My mind wanders. I notice, I return. That's the practice. Not the perfection of never wandering, but the practice of returning." This distinction shifted something in Thomas's understanding. He'd been measuring himself against an impossible standard. He'd expected his mind to remain fixed on prayer like a statue remains fixed in place. But Anselm was describing something different. A dynamic process. A constant returning rather than a constant focus. The next morning at matins, Thomas approached the prayer service with this new understanding. His mind wandered within the first few minutes. Instead of becoming frustrated, he simply noticed it. His attention had drifted to the cold stone floor beneath his knees. He brought his focus back to the words. Moments later, his mind wandered again, this time to the candles burning in their holders. He returned his attention. Again and again, throughout the service, this cycle repeated. Something unexpected happened. The constant returning, rather than exhausting him, created a kind of rhythm. Each time his mind wandered and he brought it back, he was practicing the very thing he'd come to the monastery to develop. Not the achievement of perfect focus, but the capacity to notice when his attention had strayed and to return it. This was the actual practice. Over the following weeks, Thomas continued this approach. His mind still wandered. This didn't change, but his relationship to the wandering changed. He stopped interpreting it as failure. He began to see it as part of the process. The returning became the practice. The returning became the prayer. Within 2 months, something subtle shifted. His mind still wandered during matins, but less frequently. The periods of sustained attention grew longer, not because he'd suddenly developed superhuman focus, but because the constant practice of returning had strengthened something in him. His capacity to notice distraction had improved. His ability to redirect his attention had developed. By the end of the year, matins had become his favorite part of the day. Not because his mind no longer wandered, but because he'd stopped fighting against his own nature. He'd accepted how his mind actually worked and built a practice around that reality rather than around an impossible ideal. Thomas realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life in the monastery. Change didn't come from willpower or from achieving perfection. It came from showing up repeatedly and doing the work even when it felt like failure. The small act of returning his attention done hundreds of times had transformed his entire experience of prayer. The monastery bells continued to ring at the same hours. The structure remained unchanged. But Brother Thomas had discovered something the structure alone couldn't teach. The repetition of small actions performed with attention created transformation that no single moment of inspiration ever could. Benjamin Franklin arrived in Philadelphia in 1723 with almost nothing. He'd run away from his apprenticeship in Boston, leaving behind a difficult relationship with his brother and a future that felt predetermined and suffocating. At 17, he possessed only the clothes on his back, a few coins, and an ambition that burned with the intensity of someone who'd tasted restriction and wanted something different. The city itself offered opportunity. Philadelphia in the 1720s thrived as a commercial center. Ships arrived regularly with goods from Europe and the Caribbean. Merchants built fortunes. Printers found steady work producing documents, newspapers and books for a growing population of educated people. Franklin secured employment with a printer named Samuel Keimer, learning the trade while observing how a successful business operated. Within a few years, Franklin had saved enough money to establish his own printing business. By 1728, he owned his shop. By 1730, he'd become moderately successful. But success, he understood, required more than luck or initial advantage. It required deliberate development. He needed to become a better printer, a better businessman, a better thinker. He needed to cultivate qualities that didn't come naturally. Franklin developed a system. He called it his plan for self-examination. It wasn't complicated, but it required commitment. Each morning before his workday began, he'd ask himself a single question. What good shall I do this day? He'd think through his tasks, his interactions, his opportunities. He'd consider what virtues he wanted to practice. Then he'd move into his day with intention. The evening brought a different ritual. After his shop closed and his employees had gone home, Franklin would sit at his desk with a candle burning nearby. He'd open a small leather journal and review his day. This wasn't casual reflection. He developed a specific framework. He tracked 13 virtues he'd identified as essential to the life he wanted to build. Temperance or silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. For each virtue, he'd created a simple marking system. He'd draw a small table with the days of the week across the top and the 13 virtues down the left side. Each evening, he'd mark the days when he'd failed to practice each virtue. A mark meant he'd fallen short. No mark meant he'd maintained the standard he'd set for himself. This might sound obsessive to modern ears, but Franklin understood something crucial. He couldn't change everything about himself at once. The human mind doesn't work that way. Instead, he focused on one virtue per week. For 7 days, his primary attention went to practicing temperance. He'd monitor his eating and drinking. He'd notice when he wanted to overindulge and practice restraint. By the end of the week, he'd developed some proficiency. The following week, he'd shift his focus to silence, working on listening more and speaking less unnecessarily. The system created accountability. By writing things down, by marking his progress, or lack thereof, Franklin made his development visible. He could see patterns. He could identify which virtues came easily and which required constant effort. He could track whether he was improving over time or simply repeating the same mistakes. His printing business benefited directly from this practice. The virtue of order meant organizing his shop efficiently. His employees knew where materials belonged. Work flowed smoothly. The virtue of industry meant showing up early and staying late working with focus and purpose. His competitors noticed. Customers appreciated the quality of his work and the reliability of his service. The virtue of frugality meant he reinvested profits rather than spending them on luxuries. His business grew, but the impact extended beyond business. Franklin's social life improved. The virtue of sincerity meant he became known as someone whose word could be trusted. The virtue of justice meant he treated people fairly, which earned him respect. The virtue of moderation meant he could engage in social situations without excess, which made him better company. These weren't separate improvements. They flowed from the same source, deliberate tracked practice. Franklin's journal entries reveal something interesting. He didn't expect perfection. He didn't become discouraged when he marked failures. In fact, he seemed to view the marks as useful information. A week with many marks under silence told him he'd been talking too much, making promises he couldn't keep, or engaging in gossip. The mark itself wasn't a judgment. It was data. It showed him where to focus his attention the following week. By his mid-30s, Franklin had transformed himself from a runaway apprentice into one of Philadelphia's most respected citizens. He'd established a successful printing business. He'd begun publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette, which became influential throughout the colonies. He'd started Poor Richard's Almanac, which would make him famous. He'd become involved in civic projects. He'd earned the trust of the community. None of this happened through a single decision or a moment of inspiration. It happened through the accumulation of small practices. The morning question, the evening review, the marking of progress, the weekly focus on a single virtue, the willingness to track failures without shame and to return to the practice the next day. Franklin himself would later write about this period in his autobiography. He acknowledged that he never achieved perfection in any of the virtues. He'd fail at temperance, then return to the practice. He'd struggle with pride, then recommit to humility. The point wasn't perfection. The point was the practice itself, the constant returning to the intention, the willingness to examine himself honestly and adjust his behavior accordingly. What Franklin discovered and what he'd articulate throughout his life was that character isn't something you're born with. It's something you build. You build it through repetition. You build it through attention. You build it through the willingness to notice when you've strayed from your intention and to return to the practice. The journal he kept by candlelight each evening became a tool of transformation, not because the act of writing itself held magic, but because it created a feedback loop. He could see his progress. He could identify patterns. He could adjust his approach. The simple practice of tracking his behavior made change possible. By the time Franklin reached middle age, the practices had become so ingrained that he no longer needed the journal to maintain them. They'd become part of how he operated, but he never forgot the young man who'd arrived in Philadelphia with nothing. He never forgot that transformation required a system. It required showing up. It required attention. It required the willingness to mark failures and continue anyway. Thomas Edison's laboratory at Menlo Park, New Jersey, occupied a 2-story building that housed his workshop, his experimental equipment, and the living quarters where he often spent more time than his actual home. By 1878, Edison had already established himself as an inventor of considerable talent. He'd improved the telegraph. He'd developed the phonograph. But he'd set his sights on something larger, creating a practical incandescent light that could replace gas lamps and transform how people lived. The challenge consumed him. Edison understood that invention required more than a single brilliant idea. It required systematic exploration. It required testing hundreds of possibilities. It required the willingness to fail repeatedly and extract information from each failure. This understanding shaped how he organized his work. Edison's day began in the morning with administrative tasks. He'd review correspondence. He'd meet with investors who funded his experiments. He'd discuss business matters with his managers. These obligations occupied the daylight hours, but when evening arrived, the laboratory became his domain. His assistants, a rotating group of talented young men who'd come to work with him, would gather around the workbenches. The real work began. The laboratory itself contained an extraordinary collection of materials. Edison had accumulated thousands of substances, tools, and components: copper wire, carbon, platinum, glass bulbs, chemicals in bottles, mechanical devices in various states of assembly and disassembly. The space reflected his approach: try everything, test every possibility, document the results. Edison's method during these evening sessions followed a pattern. He'd identify a specific problem to solve. For the incandescent light, the fundamental challenge involved finding a material that could glow brightly when heated by electric current without burning up immediately. The filament needed to last. It needed to produce sufficient light. It needed to be practical to manufacture. He'd propose a material to test. His assistants would prepare the equipment. They'd construct a bulb with a proposed filament. They'd connect it to a power source. They'd observe what happened. Did it glow? How brightly? How long did it last before burning out? They'd record the results. Then they'd try something different. This process continued for hours. Edison didn't work in bursts of inspiration, followed by rest. He worked steadily, methodically moving from one experiment to the next. When a filament failed, he didn't become discouraged. He simply noted the failure and moved to the next candidate. Carbon. platinum, tungsten, combinations of materials, different thicknesses, different configurations. His assistants marveled at his capacity for sustained focus. Edison could work through the night without apparent fatigue. He'd move between workbenches, checking on experiments, making adjustments, proposing new approaches. He'd sketch designs on paper. He'd discuss theories with his team. He'd return to the workbenches and continue testing. One of his assistants, a young man named Francis Giel, later wrote about these sessions. He described Edison's intensity, but also his systematic approach. Edison didn't flail about randomly. He had a logic to his testing. He'd eliminate materials that clearly wouldn't work. He'd focus on promising candidates. He'd vary one element at a time so he could understand what caused each result. This was experimentation as a disciplined practice, not as random's trial and error. The laboratory operated on a schedule that would have exhausted most people. Edison would work through the night. Around dawn, he'd rest for a few hours. He'd sleep on a cot in the laboratory itself, not bothering to return home. When he woke, he'd eat whatever food was available and return to work. This pattern repeated day after day, week after week, month after month. The repetition served a purpose beyond simply accumulating test results. The constant engagement with the problem developed Edison's intuition. He began to understand materials in a deeper way. He could sense which approaches might work before testing them. He could predict failures based on subtle observations. This intuition developed through the accumulation of hundreds of failed experiments. Each failure taught him something. Each success revealed possibilities. By October 1878, Edison had tested hundreds of materials: carbon, platinum, boron, tungsten, molybdenum, tantalum, combinations and variations of these elements. His laboratory notebooks filled with entries documenting each attempt: the date, the material, the configuration, the results, the observations. This documentation served multiple purposes. It prevented him from repeating the same failed experiments. It allowed him to identify patterns. It created a record of progress. His investors grew impatient. They'd funded his work expecting results. Instead, they received reports of failed experiments. But Edison understood something they didn't. The failures weren't wasted effort. They were data. Each failure eliminated a possibility. Each failure moved him closer to the solution by narrowing the field of what might work. The turning point came in October 1879, more than a year into the intensive experimentation. Edison and his assistants tested a carbonized cotton thread as a filament. The thread glowed. It produced light. Crucially, it didn't burn out immediately. They tested it for hours. It continued to glow. They tested it for longer, still glowing. After 13.5 hours, the filament finally failed. But those 13 hours represented a breakthrough. They'd found something that worked. Edison immediately began refining the approach. He tested different carbonized materials: cotton thread, paper, wood. He found that carbonized bamboo worked even better, lasting over 100 hours. The practical incandescent light had arrived, not through a single moment of genius, but through the accumulation of hundreds of experiments conducted night after night in the laboratory. What made Edison's achievement possible wasn't his intelligence alone. Many people possessed intelligence. What distinguished him was his method, his willingness to work systematically, his capacity to maintain focus through repetition, his ability to extract information from failure, his discipline in documenting results, his refusal to become discouraged by setbacks, the habit of showing up night after night, of testing one possibility after another, of maintaining detailed records, of discussing results with his assistants. This routine created the conditions for breakthrough. Edison himself would later claim that genius required 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. He understood that the work itself, the repetitive engagement with the problem, the sustained effort over time, created the conditions for discovery. His assistants who worked in that laboratory learned something beyond the specific technical knowledge. They learned how sustained practice organized systematically could solve problems that seemed intractable. They learned that breakthrough didn't arrive through waiting for inspiration. It arrived through showing up, trying, failing, learning, and trying again. Private James Hartley arrived at the trenches near Passchendaele in September 1917. He was 23 years old, a former clerk from Manchester, who'd enlisted after his younger brother died in the initial gas attacks of 1915. The trenches themselves defied description in any meaningful way. Mud, water, the constant presence of death, the sounds of artillery that never stopped even at night, the smell of decay that clung to everything. Most soldiers struggled with the psychological weight of trench life. The combination of terror, boredom, and helplessness created a mental state that resembled nothing in civilian experience. Men developed what doctors called shell shock. They became unable to function. They froze during attacks. They developed tremors that wouldn't stop. Some simply sat and stared at nothing, their minds having retreated to somewhere safer. Hartley understood early that survival required more than physical endurance. The mind could break just as easily as the body. He'd watched men arrive healthy and strong, only to deteriorate mentally within weeks. They'd lose the ability to concentrate. They'd become paranoid. They'd stop caring whether they lived or died. This mental deterioration often preceded physical injury or death. He developed a routine. It began before dawn, in the hour before the morning stand, to when soldiers took positions on the fire step in case of attack. Hartley would wake earlier than necessary. He'd sit on his narrow bunk and perform a series of small tasks that had nothing to do with survival in any immediate sense. He'd clean his rifle even though he'd cleaned it the night before. He'd check his ammunition. He'd organize his kit. He'd ensure his boots were as dry as possible, given the perpetual dampness. These tasks served a purpose beyond their practical function. They gave his mind something to focus on. They created a sense of order in an environment defined by chaos. They provided a structure to the day that extended beyond simply waiting for the next bombardment or attack. After completing these preparations, Hartley would write in a small notebook he carried. Not a formal diary with lengthy entries, but brief observations. Notes about what he'd seen. Reflections on conversations with other soldiers. Descriptions of the landscape, even though the landscape rarely changed. The act of writing forced him to observe carefully. It required him to translate experience into language. This process created a kind of distance from the immediate horror. It allowed him to process what he was experiencing rather than simply enduring it. He then moved to the communal area where soldiers gathered before their duties began. He'd help prepare breakfast, usually a thin soup and hard biscuits. He'd engage other soldiers in conversation about mundane topics, the quality of the food, the likelihood of mail arriving, memories of home. These conversations served a function. They reminded him and others that they remained human, that life existed beyond the trenches. Hartley's routine extended throughout the day. After stand-do, he'd perform assigned duties. maintenance work, guard duty, preparation of defenses. But whenever he had free time, he'd return to his small rituals. He'd write in his notebook. He'd clean equipment. He'd organize his space. He'd engage in conversation with other soldiers. He'd perform small acts of care, helping another soldier repair his uniform, sharing rations with someone who hadn't received their portion, listening to a younger soldier's fears without dismissing them. In the evening before darkness fell completely, Hartley would write letters home. These letters reveal the function his routine served. He didn't write about the horror of trench life. He didn't describe the casualties or the conditions. Instead, he wrote about his daily activities. He described the breakfast he'd eaten. He mentioned conversations with other soldiers. He noted small observations about the landscape. He asked questions about his family. He expressed hope that the war would end soon. His mother, receiving these letters, found them oddly comforting. They suggested that her son remained himself, that he maintained some connection to normal life, that he was doing things beyond simply waiting to die. She didn't fully understand that these routines were his survival mechanism. They kept him mentally intact in an environment designed to destroy the mind. Other soldiers noticed Hartley's approach. Some mocked it, initially viewing his routines as pointless when death could arrive at any moment. But over time, others began adopting similar practices. A soldier named Davies started maintaining his own notebook. Another soldier, Williams, began organizing a small reading group where men would share letters from home or discuss books they'd read before the war. These practices spread through the unit. The effect became measurable. The soldiers who maintained routines experienced fewer instances of shell shock. They remained more functional during attacks. They maintained better relationships with their fellow soldiers. They didn't deteriorate mentally at the same rate as those who simply endured day after day without structure or purpose. A military psychologist who visited the trenches in 1918 noticed the pattern. He observed that soldiers who maintained daily routines, even small, seemingly pointless routines, demonstrated greater psychological resilience. The routines didn't change the external circumstances. The danger remained. The discomfort persisted. But the routines created an internal structure that prevented complete psychological collapse. Hartley survived the war. He returned to Manchester in 1919, physically intact, though carrying psychological wounds that would never fully heal. But he'd learned something in those trenches that would shape the rest of his life. He understood that the human mind requires structure. It requires routine. It requires small, repeated actions that create meaning and order. In his letters home after the war, Hartley would occasionally reference his time in the trenches. He'd mention how the routines had saved him, how the simple act of writing in his notebook, of cleaning his equipment, of engaging in conversation, had kept him sane when everything around him suggested that sanity was impossible. He'd continue these practices for the rest of his life. He'd maintain notebooks. He'd organize his days around small, deliberate routines. He'd engage in conversations with others. He'd find meaning in small actions. These weren't quirks or habits he'd developed and then abandoned. They were practices he'd learned in the trenches, when they'd become matters of survival. What Hartley discovered, and what the military psychologist would later document, was that routine functions as a kind of mental architecture. It provides structure when external circumstances offer none. It creates continuity when everything else fragments. It maintains identity when everything conspires to destroy it. The small habits repeated daily became the difference between maintaining sanity and losing it entirely. Miles Davis lived in a modest apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in the early 1950s. He'd arrived in New York from St. Louis as a young man ostensibly to study at the Juilliard School of Music. But his real education happened elsewhere. He spent his days and nights in clubs listening to musicians who'd already mastered their craft. He played in jam sessions. He absorbed everything he could about how jazz functioned. By the mid-1950s, Davis had established himself as a serious musician. He'd recorded albums. He'd performed with established bands. He'd begun to develop a distinctive sound on the trumpet. But he understood something fundamental. His current level of ability wasn't his ceiling. He could develop further. He could refine his technique. He could deepen his understanding of music theory and improvisation. His practice routine began early in the morning, before the city fully woke. Davis would rise and prepare his trumpet. He'd spend the first hour working through scales and technical exercises, not because these exercises were exciting or immediately rewarding, but because they maintained and developed his fundamental capabilities. His fingers needed to move with precision. His embouchure needed to remain strong. His understanding of intervals and pitch needed to stay sharp. After the technical work, Davis would move to something different. He'd play through standard songs that jazz musicians had performed countless times. All the Things You Are, Body and Soul, Autumn Leaves. He'd play these songs in different keys. He'd experiment with different approaches to the melody. He'd practice improvising over the chord changes. This work developed his ability to navigate the harmonic landscape of jazz. It trained his ear to hear possibilities within familiar structures. The practice sessions lasted several hours. Davis didn't rush through them. He didn't view practice as something to complete so he could move on to more enjoyable activities. Practice itself held value. It was the work that developed mastery. He'd return to passages that gave him difficulty. He'd slow them down. He'd work through them methodically until his fingers and mind could execute them smoothly. In the afternoon, Davis would often leave his apartment and head to a club or a studio where he could play with other musicians. This represented a different kind of practice. Playing with others required listening. It required responding to what other musicians were doing. It required making decisions in real time about how to interact with the music being created around him. This couldn't be replicated in solo practice. He'd play with pianists, bassists, drummers, and other horn players. Each musician brought different strengths and approaches. Playing with a pianist who favored complex harmonies required different skills than playing with one who preferred simpler structures. A bassist with a strong sense of swing created different possibilities than one who played more freely. Davis learned to adapt. He learned to listen. He learned to respond creatively to what he heard. By evening, Davis would often perform at a club. New York in the 1950s offered numerous venues where jazz musicians could play. The clubs ranged from prestigious establishments like the Blue Note to smaller, less formal spaces. Davis performed regularly at various venues, sometimes multiple nights per week. These performances represented the application of his practice. The hours spent alone with his trumpet, the sessions with other musicians, all culminated in these public performances. What distinguished Davis's approach from many other musicians was his consistency. He didn't practice intensively for a few weeks and then take breaks. He maintained his routine year after year, the daily practice, the regular sessions with other musicians, the frequent performances. This consistency created compounding development. A musician who studied with Davis during this period described watching him practice. Davis would focus intensely on specific passages. If a particular phrase didn't sound the way he wanted, he'd repeat it dozens of times, not mechanically, but with full attention. Each repetition represented an attempt to refine the execution. Each repetition taught his body something new about how to produce the sound he heard in his mind. The repetition served another function beyond technical development. It trained Davis's intuition. After playing a passage hundreds of times, his body could execute it without conscious thought. This freed his mind for other considerations. During performances, he didn't need to think about how to play the technical passages. His body knew. His attention could focus on listening to other musicians, on responding creatively, on making artistic choices about phrasing and interpretation. This distinction between technical execution and artistic expression became crucial to understanding Davis's genius. Many musicians possessed technical skill. They could play the notes correctly. But Davis had developed something beyond technical proficiency. He developed the ability to execute technically demanding material so automatically that his conscious mind remained free for creative work. His performances at clubs reflected this development. He'd play familiar standards, but his interpretations sounded fresh. He'd improvise in ways that surprised audiences and other musicians. He'd respond to what other musicians played, creating conversations rather than simply performing predetermined arrangements. This creativity emerged from the foundation of disciplined practice. By the late 1950s, Davis had become recognized as one of the most important musicians in jazz. His albums sold well. Critics praised his artistry. Other musicians sought opportunities to play with him. But Davis never abandoned his practice routine. Even as his fame grew, he maintained the daily work, the scales, the standards, the sessions with other musicians, the performances. He understood something that many talented people miss. Talent provides a starting point. Natural ability matters. But sustained excellence requires something else. It requires the willingness to practice consistently. It requires the discipline to work on fundamentals even after you've achieved success. It requires the understanding that development never truly ends. Davis would later speak about this in interviews. He'd emphasize that he practiced every day. He'd describe how he approached learning from other musicians. He'd explain that even after decades of playing, he continued to develop. He continued to discover new possibilities. He continued to refine his approach. What made Davis's practice different from that of many other musicians wasn't the activities themselves. Other musicians practiced scales. Other musicians played standards. Other musicians performed regularly. What distinguished Davis was his consistency and his intentionality. He practiced with purpose. He paid attention to what he was learning. He applied his practice to his performances. He maintained this approach year after year, decade after decade. The result was a body of work that transformed jazz. His albums influenced generations of musicians. His approach to improvisation became a model for how jazz could evolve. His performances demonstrated what became possible when technical mastery combined with artistic vision. None of this emerged from a single moment of inspiration. It emerged from the accumulation of thousands of hours of disciplined practice. Donna de Verona had grown up around water. Her father, a former Olympic swimmer himself, introduced her to competitive swimming at an early age. By her teenage years, she'd become one of the most promising young swimmers in America. She won gold medals at the 1964 Olympics in Tokyo. She set world records. She appeared on magazine covers. Everything suggested a trajectory toward continued dominance in the sport. But by the early 1970s, de Verona faced a problem that no amount of natural talent could solve. Her technique had developed certain inefficiencies. She'd learned to swim in a particular way, and that way had carried her to success. But it also contained limitations. Her stroke mechanics weren't optimal. Her training methods, while effective, didn't maximize her potential. She'd reached a plateau. Her times weren't improving. Younger swimmers with better technique were beginning to overtake her. De Verona understood that she needed to change. But change presented a fundamental challenge. The patterns she'd developed over years of training had become automatic. Her body knew how to move in these particular ways. Changing them required unlearning what her nervous system had learned. It required breaking habits that had been reinforced thousands of times through repetition. She sought out a coach named Mark Schubert. Schubert had developed a reputation for working with swimmers who needed to fundamentally restructure their technique. He understood that this work required more than simply telling an athlete what to do differently. It required creating new patterns through deliberate practice. It required patience with the process of change. When de Verona began working with Schubert, he conducted a detailed analysis of her swimming. He filmed her stroke. He examined her body position in the water. He analyzed her kick. He looked at her arm recovery. He identified specific inefficiencies. Her body position sat too high in the water, creating unnecessary drag. Her arm recovery involved unnecessary movements that wasted energy. Her kick lacked optimal timing with her arm movements. Schubert explained the changes he wanted her to make. De Verona understood intellectually what needed to happen, but understanding and executing represented two different challenges. Her body had learned to swim in a particular way. That learning ran deep. It involved not just conscious knowledge, but automatic responses developed through years of repetition. The training began. Schubert had de Verona focus on one element at a time. First, her body position. He had her practice drills designed to develop a lower, more streamlined position in the water. These drills felt awkward. Her body didn't naturally move this way. She had to think consciously about every movement. The process felt slower than her previous swimming. It felt less efficient, even though Schubert assured her it would ultimately prove more efficient. De Verona thought, "This doesn't feel right. My old way felt natural. This new way feels forced and clumsy. How can something that feels worse actually be better?" But she continued. She understood that the discomfort represented the process of change. Her body was learning new patterns. Until those patterns became automatic, they would feel awkward. Week after week, she practiced the drills. Hundreds of repetitions of movements that felt unnatural. Schubert would watch and provide feedback. Lower your hips. Keep your head more neutral. Extend further. She'd adjust and repeat. The repetition gradually created change. The new position began to feel slightly more natural. Her body started to learn the new pattern. After several weeks of focusing on body position, Schubert introduced work on her arm recovery. Again, de Verona had to break an old pattern and develop a new one. The old pattern involved a high elbow recovery that created drag. The new pattern required a different sequence of movements. Again, the new pattern felt awkward initially. Again, Schubert had her practice drills designed to develop the new movement. The process extended over months. Each element of her stroke received attention. Each change required breaking an old habit and developing a new one. De Verona found herself swimming slower than before, even though the new technique would ultimately make her faster. This created a psychological challenge. She'd been a champion. She'd been accustomed to winning. Now she was swimming slower than she had in years. Schubert addressed this directly. He explained that the temporary decrease in speed represented a necessary part of the process. Her body was learning new patterns. Until those patterns became automatic, they would require conscious attention. This conscious attention slowed her down. But as the patterns became ingrained, her speed would increase beyond her previous levels. De Verona had to trust this process. She had to accept slower times in the short term for the promise of better times in the future. This required a different kind of discipline than simply training hard. It required the discipline to continue working on something that felt worse before it felt better. Gradually, the changes accumulated. The new body positions became more natural. The new arm recovery became more automatic. Her kick timing improved. The individual elements began to integrate into a cohesive whole. Her time started to improve, not dramatically at first, but noticeably. She was swimming faster than she had before, even though she was still developing the new technique. By the end of the first year of working with Schubert, de Verona had transformed her swimming. Her technique had fundamentally changed. Her efficiency had improved. Her times reflected this improvement. She was competitive again. More than competitive, she was swimming at levels she'd never achieved before. The transformation continued over the following years. De Verona competed in the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. She performed well, though she didn't medal. But the experience validated the process. She'd successfully changed fundamental patterns that had been developed over years. She'd broken old habits and developed new ones. She'd experienced the temporary discomfort of change and emerged stronger. What de Verona learned through this experience extended beyond swimming. She understood that change required more than desire. It required a systematic approach. It required breaking old patterns deliberately. It required practicing new patterns repeatedly until they became automatic. It required patience with the process. It required accepting temporary decreases in performance for the sake of long-term improvement. She would later speak about this period in her career. She'd emphasize how difficult the process had been, how unnatural the changes had felt initially, how tempting it had been to return to her old patterns because they felt more comfortable. But she'd persisted. She'd allowed her body to learn new patterns through repetition. She'd trusted the process, even when the results weren't immediately visible. The pool where she trained with Schubert became the place where this transformation occurred. Day after day, she'd return to that pool. She'd practice the drills. She'd work on the new patterns. She'd repeat movements hundreds of times. The repetition created change. The change created improvement. The improvement validated the process. De Verona's experience demonstrated something crucial about habit change. Old patterns don't disappear simply because you decide to change them. They require deliberate, sustained effort to replace. They require practicing new patterns repeatedly until those new patterns become as automatic as the old ones. The process takes time. It involves temporary discomfort, but it works. Ernest Hemingway arrived in Key West, Florida in 1928. He'd already published several novels and short story collections. He'd established himself as a serious writer, but he understood that his development as a writer required more than occasional bursts of inspiration. It required disciplined, consistent work. Key West offered him the isolation and simplicity he believed necessary for this work. He rented a house on Whitehead Street, a modest structure that would eventually become famous as his home. Within the house, he established a writing room on the second floor. The room itself contained little furniture, a desk, a chair, shelves for reference materials. The simplicity was deliberate. Hemingway believed that unnecessary comfort or distraction interfered with the work. The room existed for one purpose: writing. His routine began early in the morning. Hemingway would wake and move directly to his writing room. He'd begin work before breakfast, before coffee, before the day's other demands could intrude. This timing mattered to him. The morning mind, he believed, contained freshness that disappeared as the day progressed. The morning offered access to material that the conscious waking mind might censor or overthink. He'd write standing at his desk using a typewriter. Not sitting, but standing. This positioning kept him alert. It prevented the drowsiness that could come from sitting for extended periods. He'd work for several hours, typically until mid-morning. The sessions lasted long enough to achieve genuine progress, but not so long that fatigue degraded the quality of his work. Hemingway approached writing with the same discipline that an athlete approaches training. He tracked his output. He knew how many words he'd written each day. He understood that consistency mattered more than occasional heroic efforts. A writer who produced 500 words every day would accomplish more than a writer who occasionally produced 3,000 words, but then took weeks off. His writing process involved revision. He wouldn't simply write a draft and move on. He'd revise extensively. He'd rewrite sentences multiple times, searching for the precise word or phrase that conveyed exactly what he intended. This revision process happened during the morning sessions. He'd work on material he'd written the previous day, refining it before moving forward to new material. Hemingway developed strong opinions about writing. He believed in simplicity. He distrusted elaborate prose. He favored short sentences and concrete details over abstract description. He believed that a writer should write about what he knew. He believed that the best writing emerged from honest observation and genuine emotion, not from artifice or pretense. These beliefs shaped his daily practice. When he sat at his desk each morning, he wasn't simply producing words. He was practicing the principles he'd developed about what good writing required. He was training himself to write simply. He was developing the discipline to revise until his prose achieved the clarity and precision he demanded. He was building the habit of honest observation and truthful expression. A visitor to his Key West home during this period described watching Hemingway work. The writer would stand at his desk typing steadily. He'd pause occasionally, staring out the window or at the wall, thinking through what he wanted to say next. Then he'd return to typing. The process looked meditative, but also intensely focused. Hemingway wasn't daydreaming. He was engaged in serious work. The discipline extended beyond the morning writing sessions. Hemingway maintained the routine consistently. He wrote nearly every day, regardless of whether he felt inspired. He wrote when he was happy and when he was troubled. He wrote when ideas flowed easily and when they came with difficulty. The consistency mattered more than the conditions. He'd often take breaks from writing to engage in other activities. He'd fish in the waters around Key West. He'd spend time with friends. He'd travel. But he'd always return to the routine. The morning writing sessions resumed. The discipline reasserted itself. The work continued. Hemingway's own words about writing reveal his understanding of the process. He said, "There is nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed." This statement captures something essential about his approach. Writing for Hemingway required vulnerability. It required drawing on genuine emotion and experience. It required honesty. But it also required showing up. It required sitting at the typewriter. It required doing the work regardless of whether inspiration felt present. He also said the only way to write is well and the only way to do that is to write. This statement emphasizes the importance of practice. You develop as a writer through writing. You don't develop through reading about writing or thinking about writing or waiting for inspiration. You develop through the actual work of putting words on paper. His novels and short stories produced during this Key West period reflected the discipline of his practice. A Farewell to Arms had been completed before he arrived in Key West, but his subsequent work demonstrated the refinement that came from consistent, disciplined practice. His short stories, in particular, showed the influence of his daily work. They possessed a clarity and precision that came from revision and from the constant practice of his craft. Hemingway understood something that many aspiring writers miss. Talent provides a foundation, but it doesn't guarantee success. Development requires consistent practice. It requires showing up even when you don't feel like it. It requires revising and refining. It requires the discipline to maintain a routine over years and decades. The morning sessions at his desk in Key West became the foundation of his literary career. The words he produced during those sessions, revised and refined, eventually became published works that influenced literature. But the published works represented only the visible output. The actual work, the daily practice, the consistent showing up, the disciplined revision, that work happened in the quiet of his writing room. Hemingway would maintain this routine for decades. Even as his fame grew, even as he traveled extensively, even as his personal life became complicated, he returned to the discipline of morning writing. The routine provided structure. It provided purpose. It provided the mechanism through which his talent could develop and mature. His approach to writing demonstrated a principle that extends far beyond literature. Mastery in any field requires consistent practice. It requires showing up regularly. It requires attention to detail. It requires revision and refinement. It requires the willingness to do the work, even when inspiration doesn't arrive. The morning sessions at the desk, repeated day after day, year after year, created the conditions for excellence. Robert Chen built his first company in the late 1990s during the technology boom. He worked obsessively, often staying at the office until midnight or later. He'd arrive early in the morning and leave late at night. He'd work weekends. He'd check email constantly. His entire life revolved around the business. When the company succeeded, he felt vindicated. His approach worked. Hard work and constant effort produced results. But success came with a cost. His health deteriorated. He gained weight. He developed high blood pressure. He slept poorly. His relationships suffered. His marriage strained under the pressure of his constant unavailability. His children barely knew him. He'd achieved financial success, but he'd sacrificed nearly everything else to get it. When the technology bubble burst in 2000, Chen's company collapsed. He lost most of his wealth. The experience devastated him. He'd sacrificed so much for something that ultimately failed. He felt betrayed by his own approach. He'd believed that hard work and constant effort guaranteed success. The market's collapse had proven him wrong. For several years, Chen struggled. He took a job at another company, but his heart wasn't in it. He felt lost. His previous approach to life had failed. He didn't know what to replace it with. He considered leaving business entirely. He considered moving to a different country and starting over. He considered various forms of escape from the life he'd built. Then in 2003, a friend recommended a book to him. The book discussed the concept of habits and how small, consistent actions created significant changing over time. Chen read it skeptically. He'd already tried self-help approaches. He'd read motivational books. None of it had fundamentally changed how he operated. But something about this particular book resonated with him. The book discussed a principle that Chen found compelling. You don't change your life through dramatic action. You change it through consistent small practices. You don't become healthy through a single decision to exercise. You become healthy through exercising regularly. You don't become a better person through a moment of inspiration. You become a better person through practicing better behaviors repeatedly. Chen began experimenting with this approach. He started small. He committed to exercising for 30 minutes each morning before work. Not because he suddenly loved exercise, but because he wanted to test whether consistent practice could create change. He'd wake early, go to the gym, exercise, and then begin his workday. The first week felt difficult. His body resisted. His mind wanted to skip the exercise and sleep longer. But he'd committed to 30 days. He continued. By the second week, the routine felt slightly more natural. By the third week, he noticed that he had more energy during the day. By the end of the month, he felt noticeably better. Encouraged by this result, Chen added another practice. He committed to having dinner with his family 4 nights per week. He'd leave work at a reasonable time. He'd sit with his wife and children. He'd put his phone away. He'd engage in conversation. This practice felt awkward initially. His family had grown accustomed to his absence. They didn't know how to interact with him when he was actually present. But he persisted. Week after week, he showed up for dinner. He asked his children about their days. He listened to their responses. He shared stories from his own day. Gradually, the conversations became more natural. His children began to anticipate his presence. His wife's resentment began to soften. The family relationships, which had deteriorated significantly, began to improve. Chen then added a third practice. He committed to reading for 30 minutes each evening before bed. Not business books or self-help materials, but fiction and history. Books that had nothing to do with his work or his personal development. He simply wanted to engage his mind in something different from the constant focus on business problems. The reading created unexpected benefits. It calmed his mind before sleep. It provided perspective on his own life by exposing him to other people's stories. It reminded him that life contained dimensions beyond business success. Over time, his sleep improved. His stress levels decreased. Chen knew, I'm not doing anything revolutionary. I'm just showing up consistently for these small practices. But something is changing. He couldn't point to a single moment when everything transformed. The change accumulated gradually. But after 6 months of maintaining these 3 practices, morning exercise, family dinners, evening reading, he felt fundamentally different. His health improved measurably. His blood pressure decreased. His weight normalized. His energy levels increased. His relationships improved. His wife commented that she felt like she had her husband back. His children sought his company. His stress levels dropped significantly. His sleep quality improved. His mood became more stable. These improvements created a positive feedback loop. As he felt better physically, he had more energy for his work. As his relationships improved, he had emotional support that made challenges feel more manageable. As his stress decreased, his thinking became clearer. He made better decisions at work. His professional performance improved. By the end of the first year of maintaining these practices, Chen had been offered a position as a senior executive at a larger company. He accepted the role, but with a crucial difference from his previous approach. He maintained his practices. He continued exercising in the morning. He continued having dinner with his family. He continued reading in the evening. He didn't sacrifice these practices for his work. This decision surprised his colleagues. They expected him to work the same hours they worked. They expected him to be available at all times. But Chen had learned something from his previous experience. The constant availability hadn't actually made him more effective. It had simply exhausted him and damaged his relationships. His maintained practices actually made him more effective at work. He arrived at the office with more energy. He thought more clearly. He made better decisions. He managed his time more efficiently because he had clear boundaries. He couldn't work until midnight because he'd committed to being home for dinner and to reading before bed. This constraint forced him to prioritize. It forced him to focus on what actually mattered. Over the following years, Chen's career flourished. But his life flourished in other ways too. His marriage remained strong. His relationships with his children deepened. His health remained good. He'd achieved professional success without sacrificing everything else. Looking back, Chen understood what had changed. He hadn't had a sudden insight. He hadn't experienced a dramatic transformation. He'd simply committed to small, consistent practices. He'd shown up for these practices even when he didn't feel like it. He'd maintained them even when results weren't immediately visible. Over time, the accumulation of these small practices had transformed his life. He discovered what ancient philosophers had understood centuries earlier. Excellence doesn't arrive through grand gestures. It arrives through consistent practice. It arrives through showing up repeatedly. It arrives through the willingness to do small things well, day after day, month after month, year after year. Chen would later speak about this period in his life. He'd emphasize how simple the practices had been. Nothing complicated. Nothing requiring special talent or resources. Just consistent small actions repeated over time. He'd learned that transformation wasn't mysterious. It was available to anyone willing to commit to the work. Sarah Martinez taught high school English in a struggling school district in the Midwest. Her students came from difficult circumstances. Many lived in poverty. Many had parents working multiple jobs or absent entirely. Many had experienced trauma. They arrived at school carrying burdens that made learning difficult. Sarah had taught for 8 years, and she'd grown frustrated. She worked hard. She prepared engaging lessons. She stayed late to help students. But the results remained disappointing. Her students' test scores didn't improve significantly. Many dropped out before graduation. Those who graduated often lacked the skills necessary for college or meaningful employment. She attended a professional development workshop in the spring of 2015. The workshop focused on habit formation and how understanding habits could improve classroom dynamics. The presenter discussed how habits shaped behavior, how small, consistent practices created change, how students who developed good habits, showing up on time, completing assignments, participating in class, performed better academically. Sarah recognized something in this framework. Her students struggled with habits. They developed patterns of arriving late, skipping assignments, avoiding participation. These habits had become automatic. Her students didn't consciously decide to fail. They simply operated according to patterns they developed over years. She decided to experiment. Instead of focusing primarily on content, she'd focus on helping her students develop better habits. She created a simple system. Students who arrived on time received a small point. Students who completed assignments received a point. Students who participated in class received a point. At the end of each week, students with sufficient points received recognition. The system seemed trivial. Points for showing up, for doing assignments, for participating, but Sarah understood that she wasn't trying to motivate through rewards. She was trying to create visible feedback that helped students notice their own behavior patterns. The points made their habits visible. More importantly, she made the habits easy to practice. She didn't demand perfection. She didn't require students to arrive 5 minutes early. She simply required them to be in their seats when class started. She didn't require perfect assignments. She simply required them to complete the work. She didn't require brilliant participation. She simply required them to contribute something to class discussion. Over the first semester of implementing this system, something shifted. Students began arriving on time more consistently. Not because they suddenly became responsible, but because the system made arriving on time a visible, recognized behavior. Students began completing assignments more consistently. Not because they suddenly loved homework, but because completing assignments became a habit they practiced repeatedly. Sarah noticed something else. As students developed better habits in her class, their behavior in other classes improved. Teachers reported that her students were arriving on time to other classes. They were completing assignments in other subjects. The habits weren't confined to her classroom. They were spreading. Across town, Marcus Johnson worked as a maintenance supervisor at a manufacturing facility. He had 2 teenage children, a daughter named Jennifer and a son named David. His marriage had deteriorated over the years. He and his wife communicated minimally. His relationship with his children felt distant. He'd become someone he didn't recognize. He drank too much. He'd gained significant weight. He felt trapped in a life that didn't resemble anything he'd wanted. Marcus attended a community health program that discussed the connection between habits and well-being. The program suggested that small changes in daily habits could improve physical health, mental health, and relationships. Marcus was skeptical, but he was also desperate. He couldn't continue living the way he'd been living. He started with a single habit. He committed to walking for 20 minutes each morning before work, not because he suddenly loved exercise, but because he needed to do something different. The first week felt miserable. His body resisted. His mind wanted to sleep longer, but he continued. By the second week, something unexpected happened. The morning walks began to clear his mind. He'd think through problems while walking. He'd notice details about his neighborhood that he'd never observed before. The walks created a space of solitude and reflection that he'd been missing. After a month of morning walks, Marcus felt noticeably better. His energy increased. His mood improved. He slept better at night. Encouraged by these results, he added a second habit. He committed to having a conversation with one of his children each evening. Not a lecture, not a correction, just a conversation about their day. Jennifer, his daughter, was initially suspicious. She'd grown accustomed to her father's distance. But Marcus persisted. He asked questions. He listened to her responses. He shared stories from his own day. Over time, Jennifer began to open up. She started seeking out these conversations. She began sharing things she'd never told him before. David, his son, responded similarly. The evening conversations became something both children anticipated. Through these conversations, Marcus learned about his children's lives, their concerns, their dreams. He became someone they could talk to. He became present in their lives in a way he hadn't been for years. Jennifer attended Sarah Martinez's high school English class. She noticed the changes in her father. She noticed that he was more present. She noticed that he seemed happier. She began to wonder what had changed. Her father mentioned the morning walks and the evening conversations. He explained that he was trying to develop better habits. Jennifer found this interesting. She was struggling in school. She attended classes sporadically. She rarely completed assignments. She felt disconnected from her education. But listening to her father talk about how small habits had changed his life, she began to consider her own patterns. She approached Miss Martinez after class. She asked if there were ways she could improve her academic habits. Sarah recognized an opportunity. She explained the system she'd created. She explained how developing habits of attendance, assignment, completion, and participation could change Jennifer's academic trajectory. Jennifer committed to trying. She started arriving on time. She started completing assignments. She started participating in class discussions. The changes didn't happen overnight, but they accumulated. Her grades improved. Her confidence increased. She began to see herself as someone capable of academic success. Jennifer's improvement influenced her brother David. He attended a different school, but he noticed Jennifer's changes. He noticed that she seemed more confident. He noticed that she was doing better academically. He asked her what had changed. She explained the habits she developed. She explained how small, consistent practices had created transformation. David decided to develop his own habits. He committed to studying for 30 minutes each evening. He committed to attending all his classes. He committed to asking for help when he didn't understand something. Like Jennifer, his academic performance improved. Marcus noticed the changes in both his children. He noticed Jennifer's improved grades. He noticed David's increased engagement with school. He felt proud of them. But he also recognized that their improvements connected to his own changes. His morning walks and evening conversations had created a family environment where positive change became possible. Sarah Martinez noticed Jennifer's transformation. She also noticed other students beginning to develop better habits. The system she'd created was spreading. Students who weren't in her class were hearing about the point system from their friends. They were asking if they could participate. Sarah expanded the system to include more students. Over time, the school's culture began to shift. More students developed habits of attendance and assignment completion. More students participated in class. Academic performance improved. Graduation rates increased. Teachers noticed the change. They began implementing similar systems in their own classrooms. What started as Sarah's individual effort to help her students develop better habits had created a ripple effect. Jennifer's improved academic performance influenced her brother. Marcus's personal transformation created a family environment that supported his children's success. Jennifer's success in school influenced her peers. The habit spread from one person to another, from one classroom to another, from one family to another. This pattern repeated across the community in subtle ways. A parent who developed an exercise habit influenced their child. A teacher who implemented a habit-based system influenced their students. A student who developed better study habits influenced their peers. Small changes in individual habits created changes in families. Changes in families influenced schools. Changes in schools influenced communities. No single person orchestrated this transformation. No grand plan existed. Instead, individuals made small decisions to develop better habits. They showed up consistently. They maintained their practices. They experienced improvements in their lives. They shared their experiences with others. Others saw the results and decided to try similar approaches. This quiet revolution, the accumulation of individual habit, changes creating broader transformation, represents something powerful. It suggests that significant change doesn't require dramatic intervention. It doesn't require waiting for perfect circumstances. It requires individuals committing to small, consistent practices. It requires showing up repeatedly. It requires patience with the process. Sarah Marcus. Jennifer and David didn't know each other's full stories. They didn't coordinate their efforts. But their individual journeys intersected. Their individual habit changes created ripples that touched others' lives. Their small practices contributed to a larger transformation that extended far beyond what any single person could have accomplished alone. This is how real change happens, not through grand gestures or revolutionary moments, through ordinary people making small commitments to better habits, through showing up consistently, through the willingness to practice repeatedly, through patience with the process of transformation. The quiet revolution happens in classrooms and homes and workplaces. It happens when individuals decide that small, consistent practices matter. It happens when those individuals persist, even when results aren't immediately visible. You've heard 10 stories tonight. 10 different people across centuries, all discovering the same fundamental truth. Change doesn't require perfection or inspiration or extraordinary talent. It requires showing up. It requires doing small things repeatedly. It requires patience with the process. Aristotle understood this watching wrestlers in ancient Olympia. Brother Thomas learned it in a monastery chapel. Benjamin Franklin documented it in his journal. Edison discovered it in his laboratory. A soldier in the trenches found it kept him sane. Miles Davis proved it through music. An Olympic swimmer experienced it in the pool. Hemingway knew it at his desk. A businessman found it when everything else failed. Ordinary people discovered it in their daily lives. The pattern repeats throughout history because it reflects how humans actually change. Not through willpower or motivation. Through practice. Through repetition. Through the willingness to return to your intention when you stray. You don't need to change everything tomorrow. You don't need a perfect plan. You need one small practice. Something you can do consistently. Something you can return to when you forget. Start there. Show up tomorrow. Show up the day after. The accumulation will surprise you. Your life is being shaped right now by your habits. The question isn't whether you'll change. The question is whether you'll direct that change deliberately or let it happen by accident. As you drift towards sleep, hold on to this. You have the capacity to become someone different. Not through a single moment. Through the quiet accumulation of small practices repeated faithfully day after day. Rest well. Tomorrow you begin.